We are already past 3 o'clock, so let me get started. My name is Takayama with the Graduate School of Education of University of Kyoto. This lecture series, History of Transnational Development of Japanese Model of Education, has only 3 more lectures to go, including this one is going to end in March. After April, a Global Education Office has a new plan, so I would like to continue to have your kind support and cooperation this year. Last month, Professor Kathleen Lewis of Mills College in the city of Oakland in the United States delivered a lecture on lesson study, which is implemented in urban communities with high racial minority population ratio in San Francisco and Chicago. As one of the ongoing transnational development of Japanese educational practice. In the remaining 3 lectures, including today's one, we are going to focus on the ongoing examples of transnational development of Japanese practices. Last year, we more or less tended to focus on past examples, but this year, based upon the lessons learned from the past examples, we hope that we discuss international development of Japanese educational practices and its future perspectives. In the last 5 to 10 years, educational practices and institutions in Japan, such as, for instance, Kosen, Undokai, and Kominkan, have been, excuse me, I couldn't share my video, but please allow me to continue. So such examples like Kosen, Undokai, and Kominkan have exported to other countries. Kosen has been introduced in Mongolia and Vietnam from 2010 upon their request, and Undokai is practiced in India and South Arabian schools through a Japanese organization with the support of Japanese Ministry of Education. And Kominkan is being implemented around the world as a community learning centers through UNESCO in cooperation with the Ministry of Education as part of ESD. So those Japanese practices have been disseminated to other countries actively, and they also receive a high level of interest from other countries today. And the theme for today is tokubetsu katsudo, special activities, or Tokkatsu in short. And this practice is one of those ongoing activities. Tokkatsu is gaining international currency as a Japanese word. But what does this imply for us? Some say that Japanese educational practices and institutions like Tokkatsu can flourish only within the cultural and institutional context of the country of its origin. In that sense, transplanting such practices and institutions to other countries may not work or may get distorted. Professor Kathleen Lewis, December last year, actually mentioned that many of the lesson study initiatives in the United States failed. And one reason is that it's not easy to practice such practice like lesson studies in places where Japanese cultural and institutional foundation doesn't exist. She also said that American teachers are not used to critically reviewing each other's teaching practice, and she therefore mentioned that it is very important that explicit instructions had to be given to teachers so that they can ask among each other right questions for constructive dialogue among them. The Japanese teachers have been more or less doing rather naturally an essential aspect of lesson study through a practical teaching know-how. And there are some tacit cultural preconditions that support a practice of lesson study, and Japanese teachers are trained to do such a practice through a daily process of socialization. And this may also mean that when educational practices and institutions in Japan are introduced to other countries, we then begin to see the preconditions that have been taken for granted in Japan, become clearly aware of them, and deepen self-understanding. However, there is a danger that if we emphasize too much the importance of cultural and institutional preconditions when an educational practice is to be introduced into other countries. Otherwise, if we do this, we may simply conclude that such a practice can never succeed in other countries. This is a rather deterministic point of view. True that it is important to understand the systems and foundation which allow the implementation of a certain practice and system or institutions, but at the same time, such a practice or institutions may change according to the local context and may be recontextualized. Then, they might become somewhat different from the original ones, but they may also produce a good outcome as a possibility. In fact, lesson studies introduced in the United States are somewhat different from the lesson studies done in Japan, as we learned from Professor Lewis' discussion. Overseas development of educational practice or institutions from another country cannot avoid certain uncertainties. So we must see to what extent such uncertainties are accepted and whether we can see positive potential in such uncertainties. Now, the topic for today's lecture is special activities, or Tokkatsu in short. I think it was in 2017 that mass media of Japan extensively covered the practice of Tokkatsu in Egyptian schools. Children there were cleaning classrooms, as we saw in TV programs. And Professor Sugita of Kokugakuin University, who was deeply involved in the implementation of Tokkatsu in Egypt, is going to lecture us next month. And Professor Ryoko Tsuneyoshi, today's lecturer, on the other hand, is deeply involved in the spread of Tokkatsu in Southeast Asian countries such as Malaysia and in Indonesia. For Egyptian project, it was done as a JICA project with the heavy involvement of Japanese and Egyptian governments. On the other hand, the projects in Malaysia and in Indonesia, where Professor Tsuneyoshi played a very important role, is a case when Tokkatsu is spreading on a grassroots level. What are the cultural and institutions as preconditions which allow the implementation of Tokkatsu in Japan? And when those preconditions are lacking in other countries such as Southeast Asia, is it possible to have a functional Tokkatsu? What was necessary to make it happen? And in the process of implementation, did Tokkatsu change and was reborn in other contexts? Those are the points of interest. I'm looking forward to hear from Professor Tsuneyoshi. Professor Tsuneyoshi is a professor of Graduate School of Education in the University of Tokyo, and he has authored many books and papers on comparative education research on Japan and United States, and minority education in Japan and Japanese-style schooling. In 1992, she authored a book, Ningen Keisei no Nichibe Hikaku, Kakureta Curriculum. It's so famous as a textbook for comparative international education and comparative cultural studies. And She also has many textbooks which are essential for the study of Japanese education in English-speaking countries. Especially noteworthy is Japanese model of schooling comparisons with the United States in 2001, minorities and education in multicultural Japan, and globalization of Japanese exceptionalism in education, insiders' views into a changing system from Routledge. More recently, she published the book Tokkatsu, the Japanese educational model of holistic education for the English-speaking readers. She also kicked off Tokkatsu project, a research group for global educators, and she has been promoting very much the Tokkatsu implementation in Indonesia and Malaysia. She's going to speak under the theme of internationalization of Japanese school style of schooling, Tokkatsu. Now I give you Professor Tsuneyoshi.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to hear that Professor Catherine Lewis spoke before me. Her name is mentioned in my PowerPoint later on. And now, before I talk about the Japanese style of education, especially Tokkatsu and somewhat lesson study, I would like to first review some points of discussion in educational transfer or educational borrowing. As was mentioned in the introduction, educational transfer and educational borrowing are areas which are established in comparative education. Both have a long history within the field, and many studies have referred to the difficulty of moving one national model, which is embedded in the cultural and social context of a certain country, to another country, which has a different mixture of cultural and social, economic and political factors. However, having said that, as I have in my PowerPoint, whatever research says, educational transfer and educational borrowing has always been practiced regardless. And of course, one example where educational transfer, if you can call it that, educational transfer has a very forced kind of nature is in the case of colonization. The educational model of the colonizing country is transferred to the colonized. And then there are more semi-voluntary transfers or borrowing, as well as more voluntary, depending on the degree of how voluntary it is. And very often, even in the case of voluntary transfer or voluntary borrowing, countries which are more powerful in the international arena, military, economic, political, whatever, and which are seen as more advanced in certain ways, have been the model for other countries. And I think today, or in this series, when we are talking about national models, and in this case, the Japanese style model, this mechanism of power relationships does come into play. in the contemporary era, in our era of globalization, there is a twist to this voluntary educational transfer, and that involves new technologies of like the internet, which make borrowing easier, and also which make travel easier. And we also see in our globalized era the rise of the private sector, an increasing role of the private sector in educational transfer, which has sometimes become a very globalized industry, education industry. Now, when we talk about the transfer of educational models in our global era, there are educational models from OECD and United Nations and others, which are transnational from the beginning, and various countries will adopt that. And then there are national models that go global, and this is probably the focus of the series. But countries can adopt transnational models and national models of some country at the same time. Now, when you are talking about borrowing models from another country, borrowing national models from another country, the situation in higher education and education in secondary school and below it are different. In the higher education level, the United States, UK, and other English-speaking countries tend to be on the top of the list. These are countries which have received a lot of international students for a long time, and there are businesses associated with bringing students to these countries. Now, when you look at secondary school and below that, and the international achievement tests that are used to justify borrowing models at this level, you see a different picture. Now, East Asian countries, such as certain cities in China or Korea itself, or Japan, as well as Singapore, tend to be these, and other East Asian regions and countries tend to be on the top of the list. And the Japanese model of education would probably fall into this category. Now, in general, Asian models or non-Western models are rare compared to Western industrialized country models in the international arena. However, today there are school models from Singapore, for example, which are used beyond Singapore, and lesson study and Tokkatsu, which originate from Japan, are also such national models which have become international. Again, you can see the major role that international tests or international rankings are playing in the international or global context of educational borrowing in our present era. And what I have often been asked to talk about the Japanese style of education in workshops abroad, but the presentations are mostly in English because of the nature of the audience I am talking to. But this slide was taken from one of the rare occasions in which I talked in Japanese. And as you can see, it's in 2015 when the Tokkatsu model only started to emerge, at least on an international level. And then I talked about, hypothetically, some of the common characteristics or mechanisms of Tokkatsu and lesson study, which help them become transnational models. And of course, lesson study had been had a longer history than Tokkatsu, and it was already an international model by this time. I still think that the things I said in this presentation are pretty much relevant today. So I'm going to introduce the discussion which I made then. First of all, I identified, certain factors which seem to facilitate the transfer of or internationalization of lesson study and Tokkatsu, which was emerging at that time. International need, meaning that what the model targeted, for example, social and emotional aspects and etc. for Tokkatsu, was something that the international community valued at that time, or started to value at that time. And then the advantage is that that aspect was something that was seen as was something that Japan was seen to have an advantage in compared to the existing educational models in the international arena. And then alternative is that very often the dominant models in the international community are Western models, are from Western societies. And both lesson study and Tokkatsu are seen as targeting areas of education which the Western models have not addressed as much as other areas. And so in this case, Japan is seen as a possible alternative model or a stronger model in those areas. And then the fourth is accessibility. Both lesson study and Tokkatsu have a long tradition within Japan. However, Japanese is not used internationally. So as long as everything that is discussed about those two are in Japanese, the model does not become international. It is when it is when the information on lesson study or Tokkatsu was translated or made in English or in another language that is used abroad. That is when the Japanese style model is recognized as something, that exists abroad and then is available to the international community. Now, here is a slide that I took from the presentation I just mentioned in 2015, and I give the example of lesson study according to the 4 categories. What is the international need, or what was the international need for lesson study? There was a rise in interest for internationally for bottom-up teacher-led teacher training and learning, and certain views of teachers and children that lesson study supported, such as teachers as professionals who were responsible for making changes to their teaching as professionals, and certain views of understanding children, which was child-based and collaborative rather than competitive. And then Japan was seen to have an advantage in such collaborative bottom-up teacher learning. And of course, that it has a different and a long history of such teacher learning methods compared to the existing international models at that time, and of course today as well. But and then because of this, the lesson study model was seen as providing an alternative to the dominant models that were available in the international arena at that time. And then, of course, there was the fact that the information became available in English at that time. Here I introduce an example of accessibility of lesson study using taking the homepage of the group headed by Professor Catherine Lewis. It shows what is the their definition of lesson study, and I have the translation in Japanese on the left. Here I introduce the example of Tokkatsu in relation to the international need and other categories that I talked about in relation to lesson study before this. And here I mentioned that at the time that Tokkatsu emerged as a possible international model or internationalized model, there was a re-evaluation of social and emotional learning and other non-cognitive learning, and in the international arena. Okay, and in Japan, the Tokkatsu model tries to integrate and in an interactive way non-cognitive learning and cognitive learning subjects, as well as those learning opportunities which are not subjects within the official curriculum. I also add that today we see in both transnational models and national models the rise in interest in educating the total child or the whole child or the holistically for the 21st century. And this involves both cognitive and non-cognitive learning. Today's societies often agree on a certain abstract level about the types of skills, abilities, competencies that students need to acquire in our era of globalization and diversification. Therefore, countries around the world, when they talk about educational reform, are talking about the need for students to be able to participate in communication with people from different backgrounds, collaborate, innovate. These are all rhetoric that you find in reform proposals around the globe. This is where the Japanese Tokkatsu model comes in. Since internationally there has been a revival in the interest in social and emotional, non-cognitive aspects of the child. And the holistic nature of the Japanese style of education had been discussed before by people like Catherine Lewis, Educating Hearts and Minds. I also wrote something. So that was in the 90s to early 2000s. And but for a long time, the non-cognitive and social and emotional were not central kind of interests of policymakers and educational reform proposals. And but as there was growing interest in such areas and in developing the total child, the whole child, and holistic in development, the Japanese model, since it is a model that brings in both the cognitive and non-cognitive and tries to integrate it in the official curriculum, this aspect became an advantage and an alternative in the international context. And then there was the issue of accessibility. And again, this is where I was also involved in this, and where information on Tokkatsu started to come out in English. And then since around the 1915, the JICA has assisted Tokkatsu efforts in Egypt. Here's some information of the JICA efforts in Egypt relating to Tokkatsu, which are available in English. This is an example of some of the media reports that came out about the efforts of JICA and the Japanese assistance to Egypt. information on the Tokkatsu model, however, is lacking in any other language than Japanese. Therefore, I helped create, for example, the homepage there in several languages, and had a report from a research group in Japan on Tokkatsu translated and things like that. But to this day, there is still a lack of information in English, in other languages, and there is a need to provide more information so that there can be a discussion about, a balanced development of children and holistic education in general, and the Japanese version of it. And these, I think, discussions help educators, policymakers in around the globe, and it will also help Japanese educators as well as they try to meet the new needs and to improve their practices of holistic education. And one of the things that happened, I think, with the initial internationalization of the Tokkatsu model was that some parts of it were easier to emulate than others, because, for example, the act of cleaning or the act of serving lunch, these were visual images that could be emulated easily. However, the logic behind it and the link with, for example, classroom discussion or the subjects were things that were less obvious. Therefore, it is necessary to provide information on the less obvious for any kind of model that is internationalizing. Here I introduce an example from Indonesia from the homepage of the Center for Advanced School Education and Evidence-Based Research at the University of Tokyo, Graduate School of Education. Here I am introducing an example from an elementary school in Kumamoto City, which has used online techniques to advance Tokkatsu. Japan was allowed as to develop its relatively distinct models. Therefore, today, when you look at the Japanese-style models of education, some of them are considered as progressive, pioneering in a way, because they fit a new need of the of many societies, an international trend, and others would be considered something that has to be overcome. So it is this combination of both which characterizes a model which is often very different from the dominant international model, which is often based on a Western concept of human development and education. I end my presentation by noting that the need for non-cognitive and cognitive learning combined, as well as holistic education, are not confined to a single society, and therefore, even when we start with a national model, like the Japanese-style model of education, we can work toward a transnational model, bringing together the resources of various societies, and which may address a similar concern or similar theme of educating the total child. Thank you very much.